Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. We are diving deep into a Jane Austen novella you might not have heard of. It's called Lady Susan. Get ready to discover a side of Austen that's witty, scandalous, and might even make you gasp.
You know what's fascinating is that we have a stack of book reviews and even a YouTube video review, all focused on Lady Susan. It's like having a book club discussion right here, just for you.
Totally. It's like Austen decided to break all our own rules with this one. You're stepping into Regency-era England. Think, fancy balls, strict social rules. But instead of a sweet, innocent heroine, we get Lady Susan.
Imagine this. You open the book and you meet a woman in her mid-30s, a widow, who enjoys flirting and has a reputation that precedes her. Some reviewers were even scandalized.
Yeah. One reviewer compared it to finding out your grandma had a wild past you never knew about. It definitely challenges the image of Austen as solely a writer of romantic comedies. So how does Lady Susan shake things up compared to, say, Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice?
Well, while Elizabeth navigates societal expectations to find love, Lady Susan is driven by ambition and social climbing. One reviewer called her Austen's most confident female character, which is interesting considering she's also the villain of the story.
It's so different from Austen's typical virtue-rewarded endings. So if we're rooting for the bad guy here, how does Austen pull that off?
It's all in the way she's written. Lady Susan is an epistolary novel, meaning the story unfolds through letters written by the characters. We get to see Lady Susan's manipulations and schemes through her own words.
It's like we're reading her diary of scheming. That's brilliant. But one YouTube reviewer mentioned that this format makes it hard to connect with other characters. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. The epistolary format can limit character development. Except for Lady Susan and her equally cunning friend, Mrs. Johnson, many voices blend together, especially in a shorter work like this.
Speaking of cunning, Lady Susan isn't just climbing the social ladder herself, right? She's trying to push her daughter Frederica into a marriage she doesn't want, all for social and financial gain.
You hit the nail on the head. One reviewer highlighted how terrible this treatment of Frederica is, especially when you compare it to the loving mother-daughter relationships in Austen's other novels.
It's almost heartbreaking, especially when Lady Susan calls Frederica the torment of my life. It seems like Austen is showing us the darker side of family dynamics, even within the seemingly proper society of the time.
Exactly, and you can see how some reviewers were shocked by this, especially when compared to those romanticized notions we have about the Regency era.
It makes you wonder if Austen is giving us a more cynical, realistic view of that world, stripping away the facade to reveal the ambition and manipulation lurking beneath.
And what's interesting is that Lady Susan was written quite early in Austen's career, even before Pride and Prejudice. Maybe this is a younger Austen, experimenting with her voice, not afraid to push boundaries.
If you're loving this deep dive into Lady Susan, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. It really helps other book lovers discover the podcast. Now let's talk about the ending. Lady Susan actually gets away with all her schemes.
Right. It's a complete departure from what we expect from Austen. Some reviewers even speculated that the abrupt ending, which leaves you wanting more, was intentional, adding to the cynical tone.
It's like Austen is giving us a wink, saying, hey, sometimes the villain wins, especially when they're as clever and charming as Lady Susan.
It certainly makes you think about the complexities of morality and whether charm can excuse manipulation. But before we get too deep into that, let's shift gears a bit and compare Lady Susan to Austen's more famous works.
Okay, so we've got the same social backdrop, Regency England, with all its rules and rituals around marriage and social standing. But the vibes are totally different.
Exactly. You mentioned Elizabeth Bennet earlier. In Pride and Prejudice, you're rooting for Elizabeth to find love and happiness. But in Lady Susan, it's almost like you're fascinated by the audacity of this anti-heroine.
It's like watching a masterclass in manipulation. But you can't help but admire her skill. One reviewer even described Lady Susan as Austen's most confident female character. That really stuck with me.
And that confidence is so fascinating, especially when you consider the constraints placed on women in that era. Lady Susan, despite her flaws, is self-assured and in control, a stark contrast to the more demure heroines we typically see in Austen's novels.
It makes you wonder if Lady Susan offers a more realistic, even cynical, perspective on the Regency era. It challenges that romanticized image we often associate with Austen's world, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's like she's peeling back the layers of polite society to reveal the raw ambition, the power plays, the darker side of human nature that exists in every era.
And all this is expertly woven together through the theme of social climbing. It's the driving force for almost every character. But particularly for Lady Susan, she's a master at navigating those social circles, using her charm and wit to secure her position.
It raises an important question, doesn't it? Are manipulation and social climbing still prevalent in our modern society? Think about the world of social media influencers or the cutthroat corporate ladder. Maybe some things never change.
That's such a great point. It's like history repeating itself, but in a different outfit. But before we jump ahead to the modern world, let's dive deeper into the complexities of the female relationships in Lady Susan.
Oh, absolutely. One reviewer pointed out how Lady Susan and her sister-in-law, Catherine, are constantly at odds. It's like a game of social chess, and you're trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's manipulating whom.
It's almost like a psychological thriller.
Yeah.
And then you have the complicated dynamic between Lady Susan and her daughter, Frederica. We've already touched on how Lady Susan treats her daughter as a burden, but it goes even deeper than that, doesn't it?
It definitely does. One reviewer compared their relationship to a twisted game of cat and mouse, where Frederica is constantly trying to escape her mother's control. It's a powerful example of how Austen wasn't afraid to explore the darker aspects of family dynamics, even within the seemingly proper confines of Regency society.
It's like she's peeling back the layers of polite society to reveal the raw emotions simmering beneath. And through Frederica, Austen also touches upon the limited choices women, especially young women, had back then.
You're right, Frederica's practically a pawn in her mother's game, pushed into a marriage she doesn't want for the sake of social advancement. It makes you think how much has really changed.
Are we still pressured to conform, to achieve a certain status? Maybe those pressures just wear different masks now.
Exactly. It's fascinating how Austen can make us reflect on our own lives, even centuries later. And speaking of reflections, one reviewer pointed out that the structure of Lady Susan is almost like a play.
Really? In what way?
Well, most of the action takes place in one house, with characters coming and going, engaging in witty banter, dramatic confrontations, all driven by Lady Susan, of course.
So it's like we're watching a stage production unfold, with Lady Susan as the captivating lead actress, holding the audience's attention with every line. She'd probably love being the center of attention.
That's a great analogy. It's like Austen created a miniseries before miniseries were even a thing. But even with this theatrical structure, she manages to weave in those subtle observations about society and human nature.
One thing that struck me, and a few reviewers mentioned this too, is that while Lady Susan wins in the end, it doesn't feel like a happy ending. It's almost cynical, especially compared to Austen's other works.
That's a really insightful observation. It's like Austen is saying that manipulation might get you what you want in the short term, but it won't necessarily bring you happiness or genuine connections.
Maybe Lady Susan achieved her goals, but at what cost? It seems like she's traded real relationships for social standing and material gain.
Which brings us back to that question, what do we truly value? It's amazing how a novella written centuries ago can still make us contemplate such relevant questions.
It's a reminder that Austen's work, even the lesser-known pieces like Lady Susan, continues to resonate with readers because it touches on those universal truths about human nature and the complexities of social dynamics.
Speaking of resonance, several reviewers drew comparisons between Lady Susan and other works of literature, which I found fascinating.
Oh, yes. Tell me about those comparisons. They help put things in perspective.
One reviewer compared Lady Susan to Becky Sharp, the ambitious social climber from Thackeray's Vanity Fair. Both characters are incredibly intelligent and driven, willing to use their charm to manipulate those around them to get what they want.
It's like they're cut from the same cloth, navigating different social circles but using similar tactics. It makes you wonder if Austen was influenced by earlier works like Vanity Fair, or if these are simply timeless archetypes that exist across different literary periods.
That's a great question, and it speaks to the interconnectedness of literature. Writers are always in conversation with each other, even across time.
And readers get to be part of that conversation too. Another reviewer even compared the experience of reading Lady Susan to hearing her grandmother confess a sordid past.
That's such a vivid image. It captures that sense of uncovering a hidden side, a darker truth that lies beneath the surface of respectability.
And remember, Austen was writing at a time when societal expectations for women were incredibly restrictive. So to create a character like Lady Susan, who openly flouts those conventions and manipulates those around her to get what she wants, was quite daring.
It's like she's giving a sly wink to the reader, acknowledging the hypocrisy and limitations placed upon women in that era. But she's not simply criticizing society. She's also exploring the complexities of female agency, even within those constraints.
That's so true. Lady Susan may be manipulative and morally ambiguous, but she's also a woman who takes control of her own destiny, even if it means bending the rules. It's a complicated legacy, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it makes you appreciate the depth and nuance of Austen's writing, even in her early work. She wasn't afraid to create characters who challenged societal norms and forced readers to confront uncomfortable truths.
And speaking of confronting truths, let's not forget about the men in Lady Susan. They're not exactly the dashing heroes we're used to seeing in Austen's novels, are they?
No, they're not. Several reviewers pointed out how the male characters in Lady Susan are portrayed as somewhat naive and easily manipulated. They're often blinded by Lady Susan's charm and wit, falling prey to her schemes.
One reviewer even described the men as having the wool pulled over their eyes, completely oblivious to Lady Susan's true intentions. It's a great way to put it. And it makes you wonder, is Austen intentionally subverting the typical gender dynamics we see in her other works?
It's certainly possible. In Pride and Prejudice, for example, Elizabeth Bennet is the one who skillfully navigates the complexities of societal expectations and male attention. But in Lady Susan, the power dynamic is flipped.
It's the woman who holds the power, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and she even manages to outsmart and manipulate the men who underestimate her.
It's a refreshing change of pace. Even if her methods are questionable, it makes you think about how societal expectations can shape our perceptions of power and agency.
Speaking of perceptions, one reviewer mentioned that Lady Susan felt different in tone compared to Austen's later works. It felt more raw, perhaps even a bit scandalous for the time.
That's an interesting observation. Remember, this was an early work for Austen, and it's possible she was still experimenting with her voice and style. Perhaps she felt more freedom to explore those darker themes and cynical observations before achieving mainstream success.
It's like she's giving us a glimpse behind the curtain, revealing the hidden realities of the Regency era that might not have been considered proper to address in her later, more popular novels.
And that rawness, that willingness to push boundaries, is what makes Lady Susan such a fascinating and thought-provoking read. Even centuries later, it challenges our assumptions about Austen and the society she depicted.
It's a reminder that there's always more to discover, more layers to peel back, even in works we think we know well.
Exactly, and that's what makes exploring literature so rewarding. It's a continuous journey of discovery.
If you're enjoying this journey with us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a review. It helps other curious bookworms discover our deep dives into these amazing works of literature. You know what's interesting? Thinking about how Lady Susan, it gives us a glimpse into those social dynamics of the Regency era, but it feels more raw and maybe even realistic. We're not just getting those elegant dances and witty conversations, we're also seeing the darker side.
Yeah.
The ambition, the manipulation, the relentless social climbing.
Yeah, absolutely. One reviewer even described it as an age of depravity for the upper classes, which is such a stark contrast to that romanticized picture we often associate with Austen's world. It makes you question what was really going on beneath the surface of those societal norms.
It's like Austen is peeling back that facade of politeness to reveal that raw pursuit of power and status. And thinking about Frederica again, Lady Susan's daughter, she's almost a tragic figure in all of this, trapped in her mother's web of schemes with no say in her own future.
Right. She embodies that limited agency that women, especially young women, had in that era. Her voice is silenced. Her desires are ignored. She's just a pawn in Lady Susan's game of social chess.
It makes you wonder, what would have happened if Frederica had been given a chance to speak for herself, to make her own choices? Would she have rebelled against her mother's plans? Would she have found a different path to happiness?
Those are really thought-provoking questions, and it speaks to the power of Austen's writing, even in this early work, to spark those reflections on societal norms and individual desires.
And the men in Lady Susan, they're not exactly the dashing heroes we typically see in Austen's novels, are they?
Definitely not. Several reviewers commented on how the men in Lady Susan, they come across as somewhat naive and easily manipulated. Especially by Lady Susan, they're often blinded by her charm and wit, making them vulnerable to her schemes.
One reviewer even said they had the wool pulled over their eyes, completely oblivious to Lady Susan's true intentions. It's almost like Austen is flipping the script on those typical gender dynamics we see in her other books.
It's a fascinating observation. In Pride and Prejudice, for instance, it's Elizabeth who cleverly navigates societal expectations and male attention. But in Lady Susan, we see a woman wielding that power, pulling the strings from behind the scenes.
It's a different kind of power dynamic, and even if her methods are questionable, it's a reminder that women could be just as strategic and ambitious as men, even within the constraints of their society.
Makes you think about those unspoken power structures that exist in every era, and how individuals, regardless of gender, try to navigate them.
One of the reviewers mentioned how the ending of Lady Susan, though a success for Lady Susan, it felt a bit cynical, especially compared to the more optimistic endings of Austen's other works.
That's a great point. Even though Lady Susan achieves her goals, there's a sense that something is missing. It's as if Austen is suggesting that winning through manipulation, it might not lead to genuine happiness or fulfillment.
It reminds us that there's a difference between achieving outward success and finding true contentment. Maybe Lady Susan traded genuine connection and emotional intimacy for social standing and material gain.
It's a complex ending that leaves you pondering the true cost of ambition and what it means to live a fulfilling life. It challenges us to examine our own values and priorities.
And isn't that the mark of a truly great work of literature? It stays with you long after you've finished reading, prompting you to think about your own life and the world around you.
Absolutely, and Lady Susan. Even though it's a lesser-known Austen novella, it certainly achieves that.
We've uncovered hidden layers, challenged assumptions, and explored different perspectives on this fascinating work. What resonated with you most during this deep dive into Lady Susan? What surprised you? What questions are you still thinking about?
Share your thoughts in the comments section, and let's keep the conversation going.
And before we sign off, we have one final thought to leave you with. Think about the themes we've discussed today: ambition, manipulation, social climbing, and the intricacies of female relationships. Do you see echoes of these themes playing out in our modern world, in the way we interact with each other, in the structures of power and influence that shape our lives?
It's a fascinating question to consider. Maybe, just like Jane Austen did centuries ago, we can learn to observe, question, and challenge those dynamics in our own lives.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Lady Susan. We hope you've enjoyed exploring this scandalous and thought-provoking side of Jane Austen with us. If you're new to the Book Nook podcast, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. We'd love to have you as part of our book-loving community, and don't forget to check out the link in the description to get your own copy of Lady Susan. Until next time. Happy reading.